Fantastic. Okay, so as you guys know, we are firmly in the medieval era right now. Now we're moving along in the medieval era. So we today will start touching on what we call the High Middle Ages or the Middle Ages. So just to kind of help us understand the world at that point, I do want to take a look at larger society in that time. How were these people living? What was their world like? How did they live? So we should know that everything in the Middle Ages was categorized according to what we call the three estates. And this idea lasted well into the 18th century. In fact, it was a big talking point during the French Revolution. You know, which estate do you belong to? So you can see this idea persisted, and it was dominant in categorizing society and teaching people their place in society. So the first estate is the clergy. In other words, priests and nuns. And these could be either secular, like local parish priests reporting to the bishop in charge of the diocese, or religious clergy, in other words, part of a religious order, monks, friars, nuns, like Benedictines, Dominicans, and Franciscans. So it feels weird to us today to talk about secular clergy, but that is how they understood their role. If you were a priest who did not belong to a religious order, you were just at a local parish, you were a secular clergyman. If you belonged to a group like the Benedictines, then you were a religious clergy person, either a priest or a nun. And the clergy, either male or female, both, they were in charge of learning and educating the community. This is why we call paperwork today clerical, because only the clergymen were literate enough to handle that. If you needed reading and writing done, you went to a clergyman, so they did those clerical tasks. And remember that the Catholic game is the only game in town in France, which is where we're looking for the most part right now, because pre-Reformation, there was unfortunate and brutal marginalization of Jewish and Muslim residents. So if you were unfortunate enough to be in a Christian-dominated part of Europe, then you probably experienced, and you happen to be Jewish or Muslim, then you probably experienced brutal persecution at that point. The second estate is the nobility. People with political power who made the rules, gathered taxes, goods, and services from everyone under them in their geographical territory. And those people under them were called vassals, who then gathered more goods, taxes, and services from the people under them. So there's a hierarchy. If you're a baron, then you owe more to a duke. And if you're a duke, you owe more to a king. So there are levels of nobility, and each level, the higher up you get, has more people and more territory supplying it with taxes, goods, and services. Now, why is that important to us? Because these were the people with money for patronizing art. These nobles are the ones commissioning music. So apart from the religious music that we talk about, when we talk about secular music, these nobles are the ones responsible for it. Finally, the third estate is peasantry. These people work the land without owning it. These people are functionally slaves. They are tied to land. They don't have the freedom to move from one piece of land to another. And they farm a section of that land in a shared field. And they couldn't read. So any art they create had to rely on oral tradition. That's why the peasantry is least certain in terms of musical tradition, because they couldn't write these things down. we're like 99% sure these guys were making music, because what the heck else do you have to do? They don't have books, they don't have movies, they don't have Netflix. So music had to have been a good part of their lives, but there's no documentation of it. It's also worth noting that this peasantry was the majority of people. There were relatively few nobles and relatively few clergymen compared to the vast swaths of peasants in the Middle Ages. Remember, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, so after the fall of Rome itself, most of Europe was plunged into anarchical chaos. So what happens is these local strongmen arise, conquer their village, and whoever happens to be the strongest person in the village gets all the money, all the power, all the resources. And everyone else in the village gets the scraps and has to do the work. So after being plunged into this anarchy, we see this nobility establishing itself through physical force over surrounding people. And whatever nobles happened to be the strongest nobles, well, that one became the king. So we see how that hierarchy forms itself. Any questions thus far? Good, okay. So if we all feel good about the three estates, let me complicate that. Because here's what happens. There's a very close relationship between the clergy and the nobility. Because what happens is you need to be literate to be a cleric. Who's going to be literate? The nobles, who can afford teaching and the leisure time to learn to read and write. So nobles enter the ranks of the clergy, especially because clergyman was not so much a vocation in that day and age as a profession. Now, in most parts of Europe, there is a thing called primogeniture. In other words, your first son inherits everything. So if you are the second son in a noble family, what are you going to do with your life? You can either go out and try and conquer other places, that sounds hard, or you can become a clergyman and live a relatively sheltered life. You know, studying, reading, writing. Hey, that sounds like a sweet deal compared to having to go out and fight for new territory. So clergy, was largely made up, say that 5 times fast, was largely made up of the second sons of noble families. Later, we'll talk about the Crusades, which there's a thought among historians that the Crusades were fought for the third sons. Because if you have one son who's inheriting, one son who entered the clergy, now what does the third son do? He has to go out and wage war for new territory. So that's a whole other thought. Let's not get into the Crusades just now. Long story short, we all feel good about the three estates and the cozy relationship between them. Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about court culture as well. Now, remember, in a hierarchy, everything is pretty much going to be centered around the most powerful and most forceful noble. Whoever has the most resources gets to control everything, including what art is being made. So most music, with the exception of composers writing specifically for a church, most music that we know for sure today is actually centered around court patronage, where a wealthy noble commissions an artist to compose some piece that fulfills a specified function. And I want to call back a reminder to the functionality of music that we talked about last week. This idea that people aren't sitting around listening to concerts. You don't go to a concert hall and sit there quietly while some masterpiece is played for you. In court, and in this time period, Music always served a function, whether it was a procession, whether it was a ceremony, whether it was a dance for people to bond to, no matter what, all music had a function. So musicians, like other artisans in the court culture, were somewhere between servant and honored public figure. They were clearly skilled craftsmen, but they were not nobles. They, for the most part, were just really good at their job and were getting money from a nobleman to do that job. So notice they're not the romantic geniuses that we think of today. They're not cloistered away, revising and working on their magnum opus for years. They're craftsmen working towards specific ends with narrow parameters in mind. The nobleman says, I need a song to honor this visiting guest. So write me a motet that honors them. And there we go. The composer is off and running. So they're not being inspired by some divine genius. It's very functional, which is very different from the way we conceive of music today. Does everybody feel good with those nuances? Awesome. Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat, so let's keep going. Now, when we talk about composition, let's get back into our clergy mode because this part of the chapter still focuses on clergy. When we talk about medieval music, there we go, we can define everything in terms of 8 church modes. And we call them church modes because they sprung up from this religious music. Now, all music, sacred or secular, conformed to these modes, but we call them the 8 church modes because that's where they come from, the church. And these 8 modes are like basically scales. We would call them scales today. And you may already be familiar with this if you are a jazz musician, because if jazzers tend to think in terms of modal relationships rather than the major and minor scales that common practice period musicians focus on. So these 8 church modes are defined by 2 things: final and range. The final is the last note of the chant. That's easy to remember, right? A final, it's the final note, straightforward. It's almost what we might think of as a tonic, but definitely not the same. It's like a tonic in that it is the pitch around which all other pitches revolve. But it is not a tonic in the way that there's functional harmony. There are no dominants. There are no medians. There are no leading tones. It's just, here's the pitch that defines the mode. Organize your whole and half steps accordingly. Does everyone get the difference between a final and a tonic? Excellent. Okay. Conveniently for us, there are only 4 possible finals. Only 4 notes served as finals: D, E, F, and G. So you just go right up the scale. Now, keep in mind, in the Middle Ages, there's still no concept of absolute pitch. And what we mean by that is there is no A440. D could be anything you wanted. Whatever pitch you start on is D. The thing that makes it a D is that you then organize all your half and whole steps around it according to the D mode. Does everyone get what I mean by that?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Because I know that's really foreign to us. When we say A, we all know what A means, but that is not how it worked in the Middle Ages. Modes only signified a pattern of half and whole steps. That is what a mode is. The other thing that defines mode is range. And we're all familiar with ranges. It's the difference between highest and lowest note. So however far you have to move pitch-wise. And the range of each chant was usually about an octave plus a third, because they would go like maybe one step in either direction, above or below. So an octave and a third is generally where your range lies. Now, if the octave of the chant, if the range of the octave stretches from the final to the final, the mode is what we call authentic. If the octave stretches from the fifth scale degree to the fifth scale degree, it is what we call plagal, which is a fancy word for false or fake. I'll talk about what authentic and plagal are in just a moment. But if I'm using a D mode and I go from D to D in my range, that's an authentic D mode. If D is my final, but I go from A to A, that's a plagal D mode. So authentic, you start, your range goes from tonic to tonic, or final to final. Plagal, your range goes from fifth to fifth. So that being said, there's our little intro. Let's talk about what each of the 8 modes are. Oh, sorry, the other thing, each of these 8 modes has a reciting tone, which is also called the tenor, and that's usually the 5th scale degree. We call it a reciting tone because it is the note that that dominates the melody. Believe it or not, your final is not the most popular pitch. Your final is not the most frequently used pitch in a mode. Your reciting tone is the most frequently used pitch. So that's where the chanter would go, hang on to that reciting tone through several words, and then go down to their final. Everyone feel good about that? Okay, so let's talk about what these 8 modes are. And I put the chart on both slides here, so you have it a little reinforced here. The 8 church modes are Dorian, Hypodorian, Lydian, Hypolydian, Phrygian, Hypophrygian, Mixolydian, and Hypomixolydian. Notice none of these start with hypo. All of these start with hypo. These on the right-hand side here are plagal modes. These are authentic modes. Notice that my Dorian, which is my D mode, the range goes from D to D. So it's defined by final, D, and range, D to D. That makes it an authentic D mode. That makes it Dorian. Hypodorian has the same final. D is my final again. But notice that my range goes from the 5th scale degree to the 5th scale degree. So my range changes this to a plagal mode. Now it's no longer the authentic Dorian, it's the plagal Hypodorian. It works the same way with the Lydian mode. So in Lydian, F is my final. In Hypolydian, F is my final. The difference is that authentic Lydian goes from F to F, while plagal Hypolydian goes from C to C. Phrygian, E final. In authentic mode, goes from E to E. Hypophrygian, E is still my final, but now I go from B to B. In Mixolydian, G is my final, and I go from G to G. Hypomixolydian, G is still my final, but I go from D to D. Does everyone feel confident in discerning modes? So I look at my final first, and then I look at the range. Yes? Okay, let's practice. So I put a bunch of Alleluia tones from the Liber Usualis here. So the notation is pretty clear. Let's practice identifying them. We talked about reading quadratic notation last week. So let's apply that very, very important skill. And let's identify this mode. So we said to read quadratic music, I have to find the clef first and tell whether it's C or F. So here's my clef. Can someone tell me whether that is C or F?
C.
C, perfect. And I see a C in the chat. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, so it's a C clef. Now I'm going to go to my final. What is my final note here?
Is that on the bottom line?
Yes, exactly, right on the bottom
So
line.
is that a B or something?
Not quite a B. So if I go,
Wait.
here's my C. Then I go down a third to A. Go down, yes, D, because I'm
Oh.
just going down by thirds. Does everyone see how it's C, A, F, D? So I go down by thirds for each
Oh,
line.
there's only, I was confused. There was only 4 lines on the clef. I was thinking,
I know it's really, again, alien to us today because it works kind of the same way, but there are just these little differences that throw a wrench in the whole machine. So yeah, 4 lines. So we're just going down to D and stopping there. So my final is D. That means I have 2 choices. If D is my final, what 2 modes can this be?
Dorian or Hypodorian.
Absolutely. So if it's Dorian or Hypodorian, I need to look at the range now to figure out what the next step is. So what is my range here? Let's look at the highest and lowest notes. My lowest note is, of course, this D. What's my highest note?
B flat.
Yes, but actually, and this is weirdly enough, this is going to be your B natural here. I know it looks so freaky. It looks, but you're right. It's this B here. So I go from D to B, not quite a full octave. This is a pretty simple chant. So if I go from D to B, do you think that makes it authentic or plagal? I mean, how you sound. Yes, that Maya is what we're doing with the range here. So if I look at the range, that will tell me whether it's Dorian or Hypodorian. If my range goes from D to D, then it's authentic and it's going to be regular Dorian mode. If my range goes from A to A, then it's plagal and I would have Hypodorian. Does that make sense? Kind of. Okay, let's look at this one here. I start, my lowest note is D, and I go up almost an octave to the B. Yes, I don't know if you can see this little bit here, but we're going to go through a few. So we'll iron out the kinks. So my lowest note is D, and I go up almost an octave to that next D. So does that make it plagal or authentic? Anybody, feel free. Plagal. Actually, Maya, I would call this one authentic because it starts on the D and it goes up almost that whole octave. D to D would be authentic. So since we're going D to B, pretty close. So if this is an authentic D mode, does that make it Dorian or Hypodorian? And anybody can answer. Dorian, perfect. So this first chant is Dorian. Okay, let's look at the second Alleluia I have here. Here's my clef. Is that a C or an F?
C.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just saying C.
C, perfect. So that's a C clef. So that makes this note what? F, perfect, thank y'all. F is our final. So that means that it can either be Lydian or Hypolydian. I'm down to those 2 choices. To get from Lydian to Hypolydian, we have to look at the range. So what's my lowest note in this chant?
Wouldn't it be C?
Exactly. C. Here we go. There's my C. What's my highest note?
A.
A. Perfect. So now my lowest note is the C, the 5th scale degree, and I go up almost an octave from there. So if I start on my 5th scale degree, does that make this authentic or plagal?
Plagal?
Plagal.
Plagal, right, because I'm going from the 5th scale degree to, again, almost the 5th scale degree. Does that help? Does that make a little more sense? Fantastic. Let's do just a few more so we cement this. Here's my clef. C or F, everybody? C, good. I like the creativity. C clef, so that makes our final what note?
It's an E.
Perfect. So my final's an E. Good. I see it in the chat as well. Perfect. So we're in agreement. Our final's E. So that means it's either Phrygian or Hypophrygian. Let's look at the range. What is my lowest note?
D.
Wait, I'm sorry, say that again.
Oh, D.
E, not E. We go down a little bit. Good. I see it in the chat. Maya and Andres were saying D.
Oh, I'm actually saying D. It's probably hard to understand with my speech thing on my computer, but
That's okay. Not all of us can be Joyce DiDonato with our perfect diction, and heaven knows I'm not. And Zoom does not help. So yeah, exactly. So D is our lowest note. If this is our E, I see a couple D's down here. So we're all in agreement, D. What's our highest note?
A?
A, good. Here's our A up here. And the chat is in agreement as well. A, perfect. So this time, now notice my range is really circumscribed here. So I'm going only from D to A. If my final's E, then these D's here are really just neighbor tones to the final. So I can assume that E is my boundary. So if I start on my final, then does that feel like authentic or plagal to y'all?
I would say authentic.
Authentic, good. So this is an authentic E mode, so that makes it Phrygian. Okay. Next one, let me do a check-in here. Now that we've got a few under our belt, can I get a thumbs up if everyone is feeling comfortable? Good, good. I'm seeing several thumbs. If you're not feeling comfortable, can I get like maybe what other reactions do we have here? Like I think smiley faces. Can we get a smiley face if we're still working? Okay, okay. Let's keep smiling. And in the chat, I see, oh no, I see a very scared yeah in the chat. So I promise, let's do a few more till we feel good. Okay, so this one, I see another C clef. As you'll notice, if you go through the entire Liber Usualis, C clefs are the vast majority of clefs. So mostly C's, but there's our C clef. What is my final note? Good. Okay. I see in the chat at the same time, G. So we're really good at actually reading the notes. We're really good at identifying actual pitches. That's a huge step in the right direction. So everyone should feel amazing about that. So we've got our G. That makes it either mixolydian, or hypomixolydian. So let's check out our range here. What is my lowest note?
F.
Absolutely, F. Thank you all. Good, I see agreement. I like consensus. And what is my highest note? Hey, more consensus. Good. My highest note is C. And we know that because it's right on the line with the clef. Perfect. So I go from F to C. Now, keeping in mind that G is my final, and these Fs here are more neighbor tones than anything else, I would probably say we're going to start on our final and go from there. So does that make this plagal or authentic if the range centers on the final? Can I get somebody who gave me an uncertain face to answer? If the range centers on the final, that makes it what? Plagal or authentic?
Probably plagal.
Plagal. I would actually go authentic because if the range centers from final to final, then it's authentic.
Oh, I thought
If-
you were saying something else. I thought you were saying like, yeah, never mind. I get what you're saying.
If the range goes from fifth to fifth, then I'd go with plagal. And again, I know these are really circumscribed ranges. These are really small.
That's what I thought you meant. I thought you meant if the final was in the middle of the range. Like,
You're right. Yeah. And for the most part, if it's right in the middle, if the final is right in the middle, then we are dealing with a plagal range. So, or plagal mode, sorry. So you're absolutely right. Good. So I see authentic centering around the final. Let's do one more as a group. And then if anyone has questions, we can return to this at the end of class and I'll be happy to do more work. Let's try one more as a group. Okay. So, what clef do I have here? Sorry, I should probably move my cursor, shouldn't I? F, exactly, Maya, thank you. This is the notorious F clef. Notice my C clefs were really just straightforward little curves here. Looks like a C. But this clef here has the little dealy hanging off the back. So that's my F clef. So if this is an F clef, then what is my final note?
is it C? Or sorry, I mean D.
D, perfect. Good, and I see consensus in the chat as well. So we're all in agreement, that's a D. So my lowest note is what?
C.
Not, oh yeah. So whoops, look at me screwing that up. That's a C. Okay, perfect. So my lowest note is C. My highest note would be what?
D. Or sorry, I thought I was still thinking C clef. G.
Perfect. So I'm going from C to G with a final, wait, now I'm screwing myself up. Yeah, okay, yeah. C to G with a final of D. Whew. Okay, so if I've got a G final, that makes it either, or D final, oh my word. Too many letters in my head. If I've got a D final, that makes it either Dorian or Hypodorian. And if I'm going from C to G, I feel like that's probably centered around the final. So do we feel if it's centered around the final, would that make it authentic or plagal?
Authentic.
Authentic, perfect. So this is an authentic D mode. That makes it Dorian. Now, actually, wait, before I do this, does anybody have questions? Is anybody
I
still?
do.
Sure, go
So
ahead.
if it's centered around the final, it's gonna be authentic. If it's, what is it gonna be centered around if it's plagal?
The 5th scale degree.
Gotcha. That's where I was lost. I was like, where are we getting plagal from? But the 5th scale degree, is that like from what clef it is, or from the final note, or
From the
when you say
final.
the 5th? Okay,
Yes, so that would come from the final. So like if I'm in an F mode, then my 5th scale degree would be C. Same, this part is actually very similar to the way our modern scales work. So like if I'm in a D mode, my 5th scale degree would be A.
got it. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Does everyone feel at least a little bit better with this? And we'll keep coming back to it. This is a skill we'll keep using.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
So is there like no authentic mode based around the like C, like, or A, or those ones there just isn't an authentic mode based around them?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, let's check back in the Renaissance, because then Zarlino and Galerian will come and change that for us. But in the Middle Ages, no, there are no modes, either authentic or plagal, built on a final of C or A. The only 4 possible finals are D, E, F, and G. I think we hit the major points. Does everyone feel at least kind of comfy, if not totally comfy? Fantastico. Okay. Now here's the part where I'm really glad that we're online so that you cannot punch me in the face, because there's a much easier way to discern modes in the Liber Usualis and through all solemn notation. The modes have corresponding numbers. So D, E, F, and G are my finals. They go right in order. So Dorian is mode 1. Hypodorian is mode 2. Phrygian is mode 3. Hypophrygian is mode 4. Lydian is mode 5. Hypolydian is mode 6. Mixolydian is mode 7, and Hypomixolydian is mode 8. They just go right up the scale, D, E, F, G, authentic, then plagal. Now we said this chant here was in Dorian. It's an authentic D mode that makes it Dorian, that makes it mode 1. If I look at that number there above the first letter, that gives the whole game away. I see scrunched up faces. I'm sorry. I feel like the skill was important to learn before I give you the cheat code. Likewise. I apologize. Are we still Gucci? Is everybody still Gucci? Likewise, we said that this was a plagal mode. We said it was a plagal mode built on F. So that makes it Hypolydian. Hypolydian is mode 6. So now you also have the cheat codes. This only works with solemn notation, mind you, because the actual scribes doing this in the Middle Ages did not give you that cheat code. But if you ever happen to be using the Liber Usualis or anything compiled by those monks at Solem, they always give you the mode above the first letter. Okay, now do we all feel really good? Except for the fact that I drug you through that, sorry. Okay. So there's our moding for the day. I'm sorry. I did not mean to betray your trust. And this is again why I'm glad we're online, so that no one can punch me in the face. So now that you're all absolute pros at identifying the church modes, let's talk about other aspects of medieval music. And probably the most important is the relationship between text and music. So we can categorize a text setting by 3 different adjectives. There's declamatory or syllabic. Those words are synonymous. They mean the exact same thing. A declamatory chant is a syllabic chant and vice versa. What that means is that the text is set to 1 note per syllable. So very much like very simple. Pneumatic means 1 neum per syllable. And we said neumes are those little things that are connected to each other. So like this is 1 neum. This is 1 neum. So a neum is like 2 to 4 notes. So pneumatic text setting is generally 2 to 4 notes per syllable. Melismatic, on the other hand, is very florid. Just like in modern music, a melisma means having many, many notes for 1 syllable of text. Melismatic chants have many neumes or notes per syllable. So those are 3 types of text setting: declamatory or syllabic, same thing, melismatic, and pneumatic. Does everyone understand what those 3 things are? Excellent. Now, just a few general trends we see. Most antiphons are syllabic or pneumatic because the psalm tones they surrounded were syllabic. And you don't have to know what psalm tones are right now, but you do have to know what antiphons are. And I just want you to know that antiphons are generally syllabic or pneumatic. Remember, we said that antiphons are the chants that fill out the 8 offices of the day. So those chants for the office were generally pretty simple, either syllabic or pneumatic. Another trend is that the longest texts of the Mass, the Gloria and Credo, are usually not as ornate. They're usually declamatory and or pneumatic because they're so long. It would take forever to sing those prayers if they were set melismatically. Now, keep in mind, you can change from word to word, but for the most part, the Gloria and the Credo, that is the longest text of the Mass, are generally simply set either declamatorily or pneumatically. Another trend is that Alleluias were generally ornate and very melismatic because they were supposed to call the listener's attention to the reading and be an exclamation of praise. It's a celebration. The Alleluia is literally a celebration. So of course, those texts would be melismatic. When the last trend that I really want you to be aware of is when you see a word set to a melisma, it's an important one. Pay attention. A melisma is a word that the singers wanted to emphasize. So that is very, very important for us. Okay. Any questions on the relationship between text and music? Okay, I don't see hands. I don't see anything in the chat. So let's talk about those antiphons that I asked you to listen to for today. So these are 2 Marian antiphons. In other words, 2 antiphons that are dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Marian, Mary, makes sense. And these are Frankish chants. Now notice, these are from later in the standardization of the liturgy. These are not from Charlemagne's time. These are from a bit after, these 11th or 12th century. So these antiphons are a bit more recent than the texts, the chants of the Mass Ordinary that we listened to last time. And both of these Marian antiphons are what we call votive antiphons. That means they are antiphons with no psalms attached. These are just their own pieces. They were meant to be sung independently. So these were not used in the middle or on the bookends of a psalm verse. Also, votive antiphons honor saints. And it can be the saint of the feast day. It can be a saint, like a local saint who's venerated by that area. It could be the saint who's a patron of something important to these people. But a votive antiphon honors a specific saint. In this case, the Virgin Mary. So the two antiphons we're going to listen to now are both antiphons honoring the Virgin Mary, not attached to any psalm. Now, these are two Marian antiphons. In total, there were 4 that were used throughout the year, and they were roughly seasonal, not corresponding to the calendar of dates and times that we look at to determine our, work or whatever. They were seasonal according to the liturgical calendar. So there would be a Marian antiphon that would be like predominant from one feast day to another, then a Marian antiphon that goes from another feast day to another. And this roughly, mind you, roughly corresponded with winter, spring, summer, fall. But it's not a hard and fast rule that, oh, it's the first day of spring, so now we're going to switch to our Marian antiphon. But there were 4 total Marian antiphons that corresponded roughly with each season. Now, the 2 antiphons that we're going to listen to today have very contrasting characters, different ethos. Remember, via Boethius, we talked about how those ancient Greek ideas of music acting on us were transmitted from the ancient Greeks to the medievalists. And each of these antiphons then likewise is meant to act on us and affect us in different ways. So for instance, each is set in a different mode. Now, they didn't think of modes the way we think of scales in terms of major and minor, specifically the associations of major equals happy and minor equals sad. They didn't have that binary to work with. What they thought of was if there were flats in the mode, so like Dorian, then you had a soft mode. If you had raised notes, then it was a hard mode. So soft was very roughly corresponded to what we think of as minor, and hard corresponded to what we think of as major, but they didn't have the happy sad binary that we have. Soft modes did not mean sad. They generally meant sweet, somber, serious. Hard modes meant bright, strident, wake you up. So not quite the same as the way we think of major and minor today. These 2 antiphons are very different in terms of their text setting. You'll notice very sharp contrast between the melismatic and the syllabic texts of each. Also, these particular antiphons contrast in that one of them uses a high degree of repetition, and one of them relies on ever-increasing variation. So the ethoses, that's the plural, ethoses of these antiphons are very different. And each of them would have been the last thing sung at the end of the day, because they were sung to wind up the office of Compline, which remember was the 8th office of the day. So this is the last thing that monks and nuns would sing before going to bed. So let's take a listen to these. And the question that I want you to meditate on as we listen is, what ethos does each antiphon give you? How does each antiphon act on you? Everyone feel good about that? Cool. Okay. Oh my goodness, I've got to resize a bunch of windows. Okay. Okay, here we go. Here is Regina Caeli Laetare. What ethos does this have on you?
Regina Caeli, vitare, alleluia. Quioque mero est in portare, alleluia. Resurrexit sicut dixit, alleluia. Ora pro nobis Deum, alleluia.
Okay, so we've hit that lovely cadence. Let that soak in. That felt very what? Either syllabic or melismatic to you.
It was more syllabic, right?
Syllabic, joyful, good. I see.
Definitely
Holly,
syllabic.
can you elaborate on that joyful bit to me? So I agree with you.
I don't know, it kind of sounded like they were paying homage to like, I don't know, something good that's happening.
Mhm.
So like it wasn't necessarily celebratory, but it wasn't ominous either.
Yeah. Contented, right?
Yeah.
It was also the Alleluia section. So, like, normally that's a celebration of, like, or it's a exclamation of, like, God.
Absolutely. It's a celebration, like, yes, the presence of God. Alleluia. And good. And I see Mark put the translation for us. Thank you, Mark. Chant of praise. Yes, joyous. And like, let's talk about the mode there, because this is what we would call a harder mode. This has those raised pitches as opposed to the softened, lowered third, lowered sixth. Absolutely. So there's our joyful, contented, celebratory ethos. Let's listen to Salve Regina. Oh, wait, nope, not that one. Okay. Here's
Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, et spes nostra salve. Ad te clamamus, exules Filii ad te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in ac lacrimarum valle. Eia ergo advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculos, ad nos converte.
okay, so there's a very different cadence. What is the ethos of that Regina Caeli? Or Salve Regina, sorry, we're doing Salve Regina.
Well, it definitely feels softer, but I don't know why. But also, it's not as bright, so
Absolutely. And part of it might be acting. You notice the first one was a women's choir and the second one was a men's choir. So maybe that could be part of it, but you're right. Soft is the perfect word. This is in one of those softer modes. Fantastic. What other ethos do you notice? Contemplative. Yes, yes. Nick, can you please elaborate on that? Specifically the word contemplative. I'm fascinated by that word.
I'm not sure exactly. It doesn't seem overly sad in particular. It's just like they're thinking about, I don't know, maybe remembering or thinking about something bad that had happened, but not in a particularly sad way, just say remembering and almost more reverent, I guess.
Perfect. Yeah. And I see, I'm going to tie that with Maya's words of reminiscent. So remembering, reminiscent. And I think, if I may inject my own insight into this, a lot of that comes from the repetition. They keep cycling back to the same motives, right? And much like our brain works when we keep replaying events or words over and over again, that's kind of how this melody works, in that it keeps returning to that same motive and forcing it, strengthening it in our heads. Arranged. Yes, that too, Jackie, because it's not stretching us, right? It's very comfortable. You don't have to be a professional singer to sing this, which is great because it's just a bunch of Abbey. But it's very comfortable. It doesn't stretch us anywhere we don't want to go. Any other things we should take note of with these antiphons? Okay, excellent. Thank you all. Perfect. Thank you for really like digging deep and using your minds to respond authentically to this stuff, because that's hugely important. The next type of chant that I want to talk about with y'all is sequences. Now notice I pointed out that those votive antiphons came from much later in the era of standardization of liturgy. So when the Franks standardized liturgy, it wasn't just like flipping a switch or pressing a magic button and all of a sudden everybody is singing the same thing. This was a process that took centuries and was not accomplished in the time of Charlemagne. He only got the ball rolling. So over the centuries, new chants were added to that Frankish liturgy. The freest, let's say freest genre was the sequence. And why were sequences important? Well, they grew out of the final really, really long melisma of the Alleluia that was sung before the gospel. So remember, the Alleluia is a celebration. So in the original chants, you would see that last syllable stretched out forever and ever with a bunch of really long melismas. So what composers did was take that last melisma, and it was called, if you want to be really fancy, it was called the jubilus, the jubilus. So it's, you know, celebration. So they took that final jubilus and made it into its own piece of music, made it into its own chant. The melisma got so long that to remember them, the monks had to add new words to fill in the notes. Remember last week, we said that it's much, much easier to remember a chant or to remember a prayer if you have notes to go with it. Well, vice versa is also true. It's much easier to remember notes if you have words to go with them. Words and music aid in the memory of each other, or memorization of each other. So eventually, those jubili became their own separate chant and a part of the mass with its own rigid structure. That structure is called double versicle. It's exactly what you think it is. It's couplets, 2 rhymed lines. So double versicle, 2 verses, 2 lines. 2 rhymed lines, it's a couplet, where each line consists of 3 sections with a pattern of either 7 syllables, 7 syllables, 8 syllables, or 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables, all the same. So 2 lines, each line is broken up into 3 sections of 7, 7, 8, or 8, 8, 8. Does everyone understand that? Yeah, okay, good. Now, these sequences were greatly reduced after the Council of Trent in the 16th century. So the Council of Trent eliminated the vast majority of these things because it got to the point where they sang sequences at every mass, and they had them for every mass. And now we only use them on 4 occasions. The one you're probably familiar with is the Dies Irae, and that is the sequence for the chant for a funeral mass, funeral sequence used by Berlioz and like everyone else. So you've probably heard of the Dies Irae, or you've probably heard the Dies Irae. But that's the genre we're talking about. So does everyone feel good on what sequences are and where they were sung and how they developed? Okay, so let's talk about a very, very important composer of sequences, my girl, Hildegard von Bingen. Why was she cool? Well, for a lot of reasons, but chat, let's go. Yes, I love a Hildegard stamp. Okay, so Hildy Goat. For side note, completely non-educational side note. For those of us who still use Facebook, I highly recommend following the page Daily Health Update on, or no, Daily Status Update on the Health of Hildegard von Bingen. And they really just like post things like she's dead, she's dead, she's dead. Except for every few days when they'll like post something really hilarious. And yet she's still dead. But anyway, follow that Facebook page for some good giggles. That being said, yes, Hildegard von Bingen. She was the daughter of 2 consecrated religious. Now, that does not mean a priest and a nun, mind you. In that time, there were many types of consecrated religious, some of whom could be married and have families. So both of her parents were consecrated religious. Again, not a priest and a nun, no scandal here. But she experienced mystic visions from childhood and became a Benedictine monk. Can we make good giggles? If it does, I want make me famous, y'all. You know how to do it. Make me famous. She became a Benedictine nun at 15, a prioress in her 30s. That means she was in charge of the convent. So like she was the big boss in her 30s. And eventually she founded her own convent in Rupertsberg. She was known as the Sibyl of the Rhine because of her visions. And she dictated these visions to a monk while she was having them. And you can actually see that in this most famous illustration that we have of her. This is from a medieval manuscript. And you can see her dictating to the monk the visions that she has experienced, the fire coming down from heaven. You see the fire of divine revelation over her head, and she is dictating to the monk everything that she is seeing. So she's called the Sibyl of the Rhine for that reason. But beyond her mystical achievements, she's also an important scholar, an interdisciplinary scholar at that. She wrote scientific treatises and historical biographies, and she was an important artist who wrote poetry and music to be used for worship in the convent. So she's not only working in the sciences, but the arts. And she was proclaimed, actually, this is really cool. She was proclaimed a doctor of the church in 2012. So she's still relevant, meaning she is a teacher and researcher of theology that people still look to today. So cool chick. The composition of hers that I want to look at today is Columba Aspexit. So this was a sequence for Saint Maximus, and he was a very locally important saint in Trier, Germany. So that city revered Saint Maximus as like kind of their hometown hero. Now, this sequence is very irregular in a lot of ways. It's not what we would expect from a sequence. It has an irregular meter. It has, and when I say meter, I don't mean like 3, 4, 4, 4. No, those weren't invented yet. When we say meter, it's more like the length of individual words. So everything is very, you go from syllabic to melismatic, back to syllabic with a random neumen here. That's very irregular. She doesn't keep it consistent at all throughout. It's just whatever strikes her in the moment. It's got an irregular form. That repetition that we noticed in the last antiphon, none of that. This is very irregular. It just kind of meanders. It's got an irregular range, a very wide range, because these nuns would have been like expert singers. That's how they prayed all day. And it's in an irregular mode. We're not really sure if it's, because the final is C. You'll notice that the final is C. Now, taking that back, Andrew's giving me dirty eyes, right? Am I getting the dirty look because I told you there was no such thing? That's why this is irregular. Because what is the mode? No clue. It could be transposed something. It could be transposed something else. But we can argue about that all day. The thing I want you to take away from it is it's highly irregular. So the point being, she did all these odd, unexpected things because she wanted to create what she called the symphony of the harmony of heavenly revelation. In other words, she's not following the rules of this world. She's doing something divine. She's doing something ethereal, something other. She's providing an experience out of this world. And you'll notice that the text is based on the Song of Songs. And that is a love song that is present in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. And it's also present in the Hebrew Bible as well. Like this is supposedly written by King Solomon himself. So it's a love song. And the text, you'll notice, is very sensuous. And I don't mean that in a saucy, salacious way. I mean that literally in terms of it plays to our senses. She talks about what we see, what we hear, what we feel. It's sensuous in the terms of very imagery, lots of so much imagery. So that's giving us all of this look into the divine. She's communicating her divine visions to us through this sequence. It is in double versicle structure, but like I said, none of that repetition. The melody varies in the second verse of each double versicle. So you know how I said we had two couplets and they would mirror each other? These don't. The second verse of each versicle, of each double versicle, is its own thing. And again, the mode, it's got a C final, which is not really a thing in the Middle Ages. So it could be transposed Lydian or transposed Mixolydian. We don't know. What I want you to know is that it's highly irregular. So let's take a listen to this. And the thing that I want to ask you is, because this is such a sensory piece, and you have the text in your anthology, so you know what she's saying. What do your senses experience as you listen to this? How does this music affect your senses?
Columbas exit per cancelos fenestre, ubi ante faciem eius, sudando sudavit balsamum, delucido maximino. Calor solis exarcit, et in tenebras resplenduit, unde geme surrexit, in edificatione Dei, purissime cordis benivoli.
Apologies. I was giving the thumbs up and I missed the cadence. Okay. So what do you experience in your senses? Maya says she got put in a trance. So can we start with that? Can we go off of that? Did anybody else experience a similar thing? Well, okay, what did y'all experience?
Yeah, what Andre said in the chat, actually. Never mind.
Oh, hold on, let me pull the chat back up. Okay, made me tired. Elegantly unpredictable. Ooh, okay. So I see two very contrasting things. Tired usually goes, for me, usually goes along with like repetitive stuff, and yet elegantly unpredictable. I'm intrigued by that contrast. Fulfilling, it's the low quiet range, loud high. Ah, yes, okay. So contrasts. Good, good, good. Holly, can you elaborate on reflective for us? It's so beautiful. Okay, Will, I can go with that. That was a good save.
I mean, I feel like as far as it feeling reflective, maybe it kind of gave me the impression that she was telling a little bit of a story, but like kind of the unpredictableness, as whoever said it in the chat said that, comes from her just like having a new thought on whatever she's singing about, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that speaks to the irregularity in all aspects of this. Like, we really don't know where she's going next. But she goes there and it's always beautiful anyway. Similar, ethereal, heavenly. Yeah, absolutely. Because this is her trying to take us out of the mundane, out of the world. Range is unpredictable. Yeah. So that because it's taking the text away, we're just relying on that melisma. Yeah, it's almost like we're wiping the words from our head. We're wiping any earthly associations away and experiencing pure sound for a moment. Cool. Any other things before I wrap up with a couple final thoughts for the day? Okay. So let's talk about, minimize you. Okay. So another thing that was going on chant-wise, in addition to sequences, was this idea of tropes. And you could form a trope in three ways. You could either add text to melismas that were very lengthy. We saw that with the Eubulus that became sequences. You could add melismas to texts that were very straightforward. Or you could add both music and text at the same time at critical points in the chant. And all of these additions were called tropes. They were usually done to explain a feast day, a solemnity, some kind of important celebration in the church. And this practice began early in the 9th century, mostly in Aquitaine. And we're going to talk about Aquitaine more on Wednesday when we talk about secular music. So don't worry about Aquitaine just yet, but track that for Wednesday, please. Also, liturgical dramas cropped up. So these were actual religious plays that happened from all of these musical additions. When tropes became long enough to be their own performances, they were used to dramatize and elaborated on episodes from the Bible, including meditations. So we see musical morality plays, allegories where each character represents a virtue or vice, and their interaction shares some kind of moral lesson. Perfect example of this is Hildegard's musical liturgical drama, the Ordo Virtutum. So that's cool. If you want to check it out, it's entirely on YouTube. I can share a link for anyone who's interested. And the final thing, oh, whoops, that was my liturgical drama. Okay. The final thing that I want to share with you today is that arranging medieval music, arranging in air quotes, is a very sketchy proposition because these were not in the score. Sorry, okay, it's 10:46. If you have to go, I know. I'm just going to finish up with this final slide. But we don't know exactly what composers intended or if composers intended anything. So we have to rely on historical documents to give us some idea of what's possible. And how do we know what instruments were possibilities? Well, manuscript illustrations, like you see here, these were all collected by a scholar named Leslie Lassiter, if you're interested in her work. We have treatises that explain how to use instruments, and those academic treatises, pedagogical treatises, give us some insight. And also historical descriptions of various events. So for all of those resources, that allows us to have some idea of how to accompany the melodies that we've heard thus far. So any questions before we wrap up? Okay, in that case, you are free, my friends. I will see you on Wednesday to talk more about Aquitaine.
Okay, but seriously, go see The Green Knight. It's so good.
I have to, it's definitely on my list.
My fiance and I went to the theater to see it twice, but stayed till the very end. We saw it 2 times in the theater and did not know there was a cutscene at the very end both times.
Oh, I
So
hate it
stay
when they
till-
do that.
Yeah, so stay till the very end.
Will do.
Yeah, it's very good.
I have to. The minute I even heard that was going to be a thing, I was like, well, now I have to.
Yeah, the music is excellent too.
Who does the score for it? Is it
Oh,
one
what's his-
artist or?
What's the composer's name? I want to say it's Dan something. Yeah, I can look it up real quick. Green Knight score was Daniel Hart. He also
I
did the
don't
score
know.
for the 20. He did the score for the 2016 Pete's Dragon. Would probably be the one that everyone knows that he's done.
Okay. Okay, I definitely have to check that out.
He does a lot of A24 films.
Nice. Okay, yeah, I feel like I will be a big fan of his then.
Yeah. So that was all I had. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
You too.